The folks at Byron Seeds believe organic requires a different perspective, plan, and approach. Organic isn't simply a different type of product or even a different way of farming. It's a different way of thinking, planning, commitment. It's a different philosophy on how to feed the world. Many won't understand, but the people at Byron Seeds do. We're owned by organic dairy farmers. We not only have the product, but we plan, manage, and execute organic. We speak your language, we share your struggles, and we laud your successes. Organic isn't a way of doing business, it's a community. We learn from each other. We're in this together. We'd be glad to talk cropping plans, management systems, the road to profitability. We understand what you're trying to do. We're farmers just like you. Visit us at byronseeds.net or give us a call at 800-801-3596. And thanks to Byron Seeds. You're listening to Rooted in Organic Podcast, and I'm Brian Wood. And today, along with Mike Klein, we are in Shipshewana, Indiana, with Marlin Eash, who is the owner and operator of Shipshe Meadows Organic Farm. Marlin was also one of the farmers that was on our regional farmer updates a couple of years ago. And today we're here to just get Marlin's background of the farm. We heard the regional updates and the weather and things that were happening at that point in time, but we didn't get a full farm background before you joined those calls. So we can go whatever direction, but I think the best place to start is just what's your history with this farm and how did you get started and where are we at today?
Okay, so again, this is Marlin Eash, and I guess a little bit on my family would be I'm the third generation to live on this farm. My grandpa bought the farm out of foreclosure in 1940. So it's my wife and I, and we have 8 children, ages 22 to 3. The 2 oldest ones are married, and then the third one has an off-farm job, and the one son helps me on the farm, and then there's 3 children in school, and then I've got one that's still at home with me and Mom. So a little bit of a dairy specs would be, so this farm is approximately 100 acres, and since we are of the plain community, we farm all that with horses, and we usually run about 45 cows, and then the heifers are raised off the farm, and there's various reasons for that. One being it helps with the labor issue, and then also in a drought situation it helps minimize the drought risk since those heifers are on another farm. And then our cows are the Holstein Friesian breed as well. So a little bit of history of the farm. In around 1940, Grandpa bought this farm out of foreclosure, and it was your typical farm of being, it was run down by the prior owner, and it was highly dilapidated, totally dysfunctional, and Grandpa was warned by the locals that once he bought the farm, he was warned by the local people that he would never be able to make a profit on that farm, and that persuaded Grandpa in his mind that he would show these guys. So he farmed in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and those were fairly good time for the plain community as far as farms were concerned. Grandpa told me that he raised quite a bit of wheat and hogs, which were the mortgage lifters during that time. No longer the story as far as that goes. And then Dad took the farm over in the 70s and the 80s and into the 90s, and those were difficult times because there was high interest rates and low market prices. And the farm went through quite a few changes there. We started out growing hogs, which that market went to pot, and it just wasn't a very profitable situation. And then in about 1984, we were raising springing heifers at that time, and so we'd buy heifers, put them on pasture, and get them bred, and as springing heifers, we'd sell them on the market, which was fairly good at that time. But in '84, there was a disease going through Indiana, and I forget what the disease was. But every heifer had, before she could go to market, she had to be tested by a vet. And we had a group of heifers that were quarantined because of this. They tested positive for this particular disease. So we had no choice but to start milking cows because these were springing heifers. They're going to freshen within the next month or two. So we quickly set up an impromptu milking system. It was nothing fancy. I mean, we're talking 3 wooden stanchions in a pole barn with an 8-horse Honda hooked to a vacuum pump and a windmill that pumped cold water through a holding tank. And that, of course, we milked into canned milk cans at that time, set them in the cold water. The water runs through that particular tank, and that's how the milk was cooled. So today that system would obviously never work, but I'm sure it was more difficult than all that as far as getting everything set up. But nonetheless, we were suddenly milking cows, and so we improved the milking situation as far as the stanchion setups. We built a flat barn with 4 stanchions, nothing fancy, but it did work for us. And during those times we had, and so now we get into a little bit more of so I'm talking about the history of the farm, but this all leads up to my reason for transitioning to organic. So the crop rotation we had at that time was really slow. This was late 80s.
So Marlin, can I back you up? What year did the hogs go kaput?
You talk to different farmers, they might give you a different date, but I would say it was right in that about 1986 or 7 is when we got out of it. I think the market was going south before that.
So you started milking and still had hogs?
Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We were running springing heifers and hogs. That was our cash flow.
Mm-hmm.
And once we got out of the hogs, we did up the cow numbers because we did improve our milking situation a little bit to where we could put more cows through the parlor. So our crop rotation was pretty slow at that time. We raised a lot of corn, and a few reasons why we did that. And I think that you're pretty run-of-the-mill farmer in this particular area at that time. We raised a lot of corn for 2 reasons. The first one was, obviously, when we had hogs, we needed a lot of corn, but it was easy to raise because herbicides were becoming mainstream, and it's what everybody used. And my dad was from the old school where he was used to cultivating corn for weed control, and now they had these atrazine and 2,4-D to control weeds, and this was great. This was just this is what they were after. They loved this. And the other thing that happened is we went from husking corn by hand to using the corn picker, and suddenly corn harvest was fun. So we were doing maybe 40, 50 acres of corn, and we had fields that were continuous corn for 4 years, which was not a very good crop rotation, but that's what we did because corn was easy. The other thing I find interesting is Dad always said, well, raising a corn crop is a lot cheaper than raising an alfalfa crop. And I never really, I don't agree with that today, but nonetheless, that was one of his things. And I think it was strictly coming from the seed perspective. But anyway, we were using a lot of chemicals. If we saw a weed that we didn't like, we sprayed it. And if we saw a bug we didn't like, we sprayed it. And if a cow was sick, we gave it a shot. Well, it didn't matter what it was. We gave them penicillin, and back in the day it was Combiotic, all sorts of different antibiotics. And that's sort of the way we farmed. We fed our cows a lot of grain, fed them a lot of protein. We had a lot of inputs. We had lots of milk, low components. But at that time, high component milk wasn't really that popular and didn't pay all that well. But this particular operation was not profitable. And one of the reasons why was because that our cow, because the way we fed our cows, they never lasted long. So if we had a cow that had 4 calves on the ground, she was old in our herd, because feeding a cow a lot of grain and putting a lot of inputs in that cow, we didn't feed her correctly. Number one, we didn't have a nutritionist to balance any rations for us. We were just doing what we thought worked. And so we were burning those cows out pretty fast. And that, I think, was one of the reasons why this farm wasn't profitable. We never really saw, so we just kept going. I remember when I was 14 years old, we had our first DA, which is basically a twisted stomach in a cow. Displaced abomasum, I think, is what DA stands for. Mm-hmm. So that was our first one, and I remember the vet telling us. So I remember I watched him perform the surgery, and Dad asked him what this was and what happened, what caused it, and he explained it as far as, probably pushing the cows a little bit too hard, and you pushed her over the edge, and conditions were right that made her get a displaced abomasum. And he said it's pretty mainstream anymore. I mean, I have these surgeries maybe 3 or 4 times a week, and so we were very comfortable with the idea that at least we were normal. So, but that left an impression on me later. I thought back on this event and this is not normal. A cow shouldn't have these types of problems. So that was a general farming. That's the way everything was working in our general area. We were looking at high production, and one thing I do remember is a lot of the farmers in our particular area weren't really talking to each other. They were all doing their own thing. And so moving along at about the turn of the century, around 2001, I was married, and I was working off farm at that time in the local RV factory. And I did work in that setting until 2005, when I then took over the operation of our farm. But during that time, from the time I was married until 2005, I was thinking at some point in time I'm going to take over this operation, and this operation isn't really profitable. It was keeping Mom and Dad fed, and they were doing okay, but not a whole lot was left over. So how in the world is this young guy ever going to make this work? I knew the odds were stacked against me, and I had these visions of shiny TMR mixers and big freestall barns and nice big cows producing all sorts of milk. I thought that's the only way we're going to do this. And I also knew that's going to take a lot of borrowed money to do that. So how does this work? I was, in my mind, I never was comfortable with that idea, and yet it was the only idea that I had because it's the only idea I was familiar with. But I remember in 2004, I attended the first, so up to that point, in about 2003, I heard somebody talk about moving fences in a pasture field and managing pastures. And at first we sort of laughed at that idea. And then in 2004, I attended my first conference that we now call the Northern Indiana Grazing Conference. And that was sort of my beginning in changing our operation and getting this thing to where it's profitable. For me, I did not know it at that time, but for our farm, a new day was dawning. And looking back, I find that really interesting, is that was sort of the point where we started thinking differently. I attended that conference, and the first thing I noticed was just the general environment of that, just the atmosphere and the environment in that conference. Not a lot of farmers, maybe 400 people. And today, that same conference is closer to 1,000, 1,200 people. But nonetheless, the general attitude of those farmers was upbeat, and it was contagious. And I went home thinking, we're going to give this a try. One of the reasons that I really liked this idea of managing pastures was that it didn't take a lot of infrastructure. Did not take a lot of upfront cost, where a big freestall barn with a shiny TMR with a big tractor to power that TMR was going to take a lot of capital to begin with. And we could see all around us that whole model wasn't working because farmers were still going out of business. And so we got started in the grazing thing in 2005, took over the farm, and we started moving fences and managing some pastures, put in some new seedings. The first thing I did that was really off the wall, and that was I took a perfectly fine crop field that worked well for alfalfa and corn and planted it to permanent pasture, and that was just really off the wall. This guy's going nuts. I remember. And then the next thing I did, so we did that, and it worked well. The pasture took off. It was a good quality pasture. Cows milked well on it. And the next thing we did, and here is a thing that got me started thinking about transitioning to organic. So my dad never had a nutritionist on the farm. And so when I took over the farm, the company I was buying our supplements from stopped in and got to know me as a new manager and said, would you like us to take some forage tests and do some ration balancing for you? And I said, well, sure. I had no idea what that meant. Well, yeah, so they took some samples, forage samples. And when the nutritionist came back with the forage samples, I think he took 3 different samples, and every one of them, the potassium level was circled. The potassium level in the alfalfa was circled, and he said, do not feed to dry cows. Well, that's exactly what we were doing. At that time, the lactating herd and the dry cows were all one group. They all got the same hay. And he said, don't feed this to dry cows. And I said, so why not? And he said, well, this is all high potassium hay, and feeding too much high potassium hay to dry cows can create all sorts of metabolic issues such as milk fevers, retained placentas, anything in the line of metabolic issues. And the funny thing was, he just described all our problems, and I didn't even tell him. And I said, well, I told him, you just told me all the issues that we're facing as a dairy farm. And I said, yeah, well, you need to be more choosy about the type of hay you feed your dry cows. You need to separate your dry cows from your milk cows. And so we built a freestall barn, and during that process, we were able to separate the 2 cows, the dry cows, from the dairy cows. So that was in the spring, and then in the fall of 2005, I believe it was, Dad said, it's getting to be fall. You need to put on about 200 pounds of 0060, which is called potassium sulfate or potash, muriate of potash. And the interesting thing was that we had a big fertilizer company right in our town, right 2 miles from our farm, and we did everything that they said, basically, because everybody else did too. So today in our area, there's all sorts of fertilizer dealers and fertilizer people who would like to help you with your fertility. And most of them are good people, and they would not misguide you. But at that time, there was basically one. And they had their thing was that you need to put on 0060 at 250 pounds every year per acre on your alfalfas. And so Dad's told me, no, you need to get them out to put this on. And I was really ignorant at that time, but I remember thinking, potash, I think that's potassium. And so my nutritionist just told me my forages are high in potassium. Why am I putting on more potassium? And I actually had the nerve so I called up the local fertilizer people and said, how much potassium do I need to put on our alfalfa fields in the fall? And without blinking an eye, I said, well, you need at least 250 pounds. That's just maintenance. If your soils are a little bit low on potassium, you need to put on more. And there was a little bit of silence, and I said, so why are my forages high in potassium if I need to put on more potash? And he didn't skip a beat. He just says, well, I don't know about that, but I just do know you need 250 pounds of potash. So me being ignorant, I did not argue with him or tell him I don't want to. I said, okay, because that was what everybody else did. And that's what they recommended. So I did. But that was the beginning of my journey to organics, that something is wrong with this picture. The people who are working my soil, or the people who are helping me with the soil, are totally disconnected from the animals. I did not totally put that together at that time, but there was enough of a red flag with that system, with that setting. And let me back up. My nutritionist, I asked him, how do I get the potassium down in my forages? And he told me the same thing the other guy did. He just said, Well, I don't know. You're going to have to talk to your agronomist. I just know you don't want it that high for dry cows. So that was the first statement that a nutritionist made. And then I asked the agronomist, why do I need 250 pounds of potash? And he said, well, if my forages are that high, why do I need 250 pounds of potash in my soil? And he said, I don't know about your forages, but I do know you need 250 pounds of potash. So I knew those two people were totally disconnected. So then I started talking to a biological company, a company that worked with more of the biological minerals, tried to let the soil do its own work, and only helping the soil do its own work, not get in the way. And I remember I had bought some fertilizer from this biological company. They were a no-name company in our area, and was planting some corn, was using some of the corn starter, and one of the bags was out in the fence row right by the road, and it wasn't your local run-of-the-mill company. And some of the local neighbors saw this bag, and one of them made a comment to my dad at the sale barn a couple weeks later. Said, "So I see your son's farming a little differently." So, anyway, as we moved through a couple more years of farming biologically, we suddenly seen we were so close to organic, and at that time, Organic Valley was taking on new milk in our area. We had a few farms transitioning, and the pay price was, if I remember correctly, I think it was like $22 when I first started organic transition. By the time I actually got on the truck, I believe it was $24. Conventional was $9 or $10 at that time. That was 2009. And so the difference in price was just phenomenal. And that was for us, cash flowing on the farm, it totally changed gears when we were able to sell organic milk. So that's sort of the history as far as how we got to organics. But that was only the beginning of what organics actually did for us. Our farm actually went through a withdrawal process, a withdrawal from using all those chemicals. Not everything worked as well as we would have liked it to when we no longer were supported by the crutches of herbicides and pesticides and commercial fertilizers. Our soils had become used to those things, and once we took it away from them, it was just like the guy that had a drug habit. He had withdrawal symptoms, and we went through that as well.
So how was it, I know sometimes approaching your dad with completely changing the operation is sometimes a really hard conversation to have. How was that? Because I know, like my dad as well, when the herbicides came in at first, it was absolutely incredible how they worked. And then to throw all that away and go back to that sometimes it doesn't go as well with the older generation. How was that with you?
To put it mildly, it was horrendous.
Okay.
Dad was anti-organic, and Dad was a careful farmer, but Dad did not. He was a careful farmer, and because of that, he did not like to take risks. He would have rather kept beating his head against the wall and wishing that it wouldn't hurt he would rather just keep hitting his head against the wall instead of stopping. And he just wished it wouldn't hurt, if you follow me on that. Mm-hmm. So when I first exposed to him the idea of maybe not using chemicals at all, he lost it. He just said, "There's no way. You're not going to do this on our farm." And I was stubborn enough. We had some shouting matches. We did. And I just kept going. I learned a few things when dealing with the older generation, or when something new has to happen on your farm. And this goes with any farm, any type of change, and that is, it is much better to, if there is a better way to do something, it is much better and more effective to show them how this works instead of telling them how it's going to work. Because I learned that no amount of foot stamping or finger pointing or yelling would convince him of anything. But once I did the work and showed him that there was a better way, he warmed up to him. It took him a few years. It took him longer to warm up to that idea than it did for me to transition the farm. Let's put it that way. But he is a supporter of organic farming today. So I could, trying to think if there's more on that subject. There's, as far as, so Dad did help me on the farm as far as providing labor. And during that transition, when we were in that 3-year organic transition, things didn't go too well because in his mind, he was programmed on how to make things work conventionally. So instead of taking the field sprayer out and spraying the corn at pre or post emergent, we were taking out the old rotary hose. We were getting those off of the junk pile and greasing them up and using them. And we were trying to fine tune the cultivators because we were cultivating corn at maybe day 18. And so we had to dig out the shields and so forth. And this was, to him, this was a reminder of back in the day when they had weedy corn. But I found that one of the things I'm finding with transition, with organic today versus the organic of maybe, so there was a period in time, was it the 60s and the 70s, when there was this little organic thing that went through our area, I believe, and it didn't work too well because I think one of the big things was they didn't have the equipment to farm organically and they didn't have the know-how, and so it didn't go very well. And so when talking to my dad about organic, that's the picture that he had, was totally weedy corn. No, the yield of corn was not very good. And that was quite the opposite for us. We were able to raise corn, even in our first year, we were able to raise 150 bushel corn. That was fairly close to weed free, was very respectable. So a few years of that, why he started seeing that this can work. So
I want to go back to just for a minute because I'm always curious about this. But when you first started milking, you said into cans. Was there a grade B cheese market? Where was that milk going? And what was it? Was there a local creamery, or what was your market?
So it was grade B, and it went to a local cheese house called it's called Heritage Creamery today, but at that time it was called Duskay's House. And that was actually sort of interesting. That has a nice little story to it as well. That was actually started as a local co-op among the Plain people that didn't work out too well. I don't know all the details, but it didn't work out that well. It was a great idea to provide a market for canned milk, and it did provide the market for, I would say, maybe into the 90s.
There was a grade B market in this area until just 10 years ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
For
Right.
cans
Yep.
or really?
Yep.
Yeah, we just had the last route in Ohio. There's still one per place that takes canned milk in Ohio that I know of. Middlefield Cheese, I think, still
Okay.
does.
So when you were looking at grazing, you just said that you decided to go to this meeting, but what was the background? What made you even aware that this meeting existed? And then why did you decide to go when your whole experience was high production, everything anti, grazing and high yield corn and high production cows? What made you even question that?
Well, first of all, the big thing was I always had this uneasy feeling in my gut about that high capital model of high production cows. It never really resonated with me, but like I said, it's the only model I knew. So when something else came along, I listened. My first exposure to this was probably a brother-in-law of mine got involved, and he was playing with us a little bit, and he talked to me about it, moving fences and managing pasture. And how I found out about this grazing conference, I was trying to think about that this morning. I have no idea. And I don't even know what pushed me to go. It was something different. And at that time, I was at the perfect time in life of absorbing new ideas. So I was 25 years old at the time. And all ideas at that time sounded good to me, I guess. And so I remember just walking in there, and the atmosphere just blew me away. Because up until that point, my experience with fellowshipping with other farmers, it was always sort of negative. That fellowship looked like the local hay auction or the local livestock auction, where farmers were always complaining about the price they were receiving or had to pay for their inputs. And these guys were talking new ways of farming and doing things that put your farm in control of your inputs. We still were price takers at that time. We were still selling milk to the conventional market, and we had no control over what that price would do. But the thing that they were controlling was their input side. And they were really talking about how exciting this is to produce milk in a low-cost environment.
Mm-hmm. So did you have a mentor that taught you how to graze, or did you just buy electric fence and figure it out?
We did. We bought electric fence. I went to my first fencer was the old Parmac. I think every grazer starts out with a good old Parmac.
You can change. Good thing about them is you can change the fence without turning it off.
I remember I had the system that I had this Parmac, and so I bought everything at the local hardware. The fencer, the polywire, the posts, everything came from local hardware. And which they were, by today's standards, they were not well equipped, to put it mildly. But I remember moving fence to where the system was so backwards that I actually had to, the fencer was in the wrong spot. And so not wanting to always walk to one end of the field to shut the fencer off to move the fence, I would wear this big, thick, insulated glove and just grab a hold of the wire with that thing. And it zapped me a little bit, but it wasn't too bad. But I was young, I could do it. Today, I'd break out in a sweat if I try that again. But I remember I did it totally backwards. I probably broke every grazing rule there was to break. But we learned from that. And as far as a mentor, I can't really pinpoint any particular person as being a mentor. The big thing was probably, like I said, I had a brother-in-law that was dabbling in that. I myself was the only farmer in this particular area that was grazing at that time. So probably I started associating with a seed dealer that catered to the grazers, and he was probably my biggest source of information. And then I started reading books and magazines that pertained to grazing. Learned a lot of things through that as well. And a lot of it, some of it was just plain by doing things wrong. I did my first paddock, my first pasture, I actually broke up in 4 permanent paddocks, and I broke them up the long way. So the field was a rectangle. Instead of having a cross wire going the short distance across, they went the long way. I don't know why I did it. I didn't know any different. And I did that for a few years and found out that really isn't the way to do it. So, like I said, we broke every rule there was to break. And one thing I had going for me at that time, we were not milking a lot of cows at that time. So making those mistakes wasn't as bank breaking as it would have if you're going to be running high production, if you're going to be running a lot of cows on a few acres, on a small amount of acres, you can't afford to make a lot of mistakes. At that time, we had low cow numbers. And getting into the history again, when I took over the farm, we were milking 15, 20 cows. And that number was not enough to produce, that amount of cows was not a big enough number to produce cash flow to finance any debt load. So that, again, that is why that big freestyle barn, obviously we would have bought more cows, but somehow we would have had to pay for all that. And the cash flow that I had at that time would not have come close to financing any of that. I'm not even sure I could have got a loan for any of that stuff. The one thing I want to point out here is when I took over the management of the farm, our farm was in a unique position, and that is it was equity rich but cash poor. The farm was debt free. The farm was debt free, but the amount of cash that it was generating was too low to do any type of infrastructure upgrades. And in my mind, my experience with that would be I would much rather take over the management of the farm that has debt, but that has the cash flow to service that debt. Too much debt is not a good thing, but no debt is not necessarily the best position to be in. I just find that it is interesting. If we have enough cash flow going on, whatever operation we're on, debt can be healthy.
Because if you have no debt, what's your drive?
Exactly.
I mean, I have a friend who thrives on debt and makes it work. Me, on the other hand, not a fan. I want to thrive without the drive. But I see exactly what you mean. The business needs to be generating a cash flow.
Well, that might have been unique at that time, but today that is happening again. That situation that you mentioned of cash flow poor but equity rich, and that was the part of the drive to look at other models. I know I'm jumping way ahead to right now, but do you still see as organic as one of those models to help that cash flow situation?
Oh, definitely. Especially on our small farms. And when I say small farms, I would hate to put a number to small farms, but as far as what designates a small farm, in my mind, we're a small farm. We're milking 40 to 50 cows. I find that, and my experience was going back to, so when we were raising 40 acres of corn in the 80s and into the 90s, and we were not even using all that, we were not utilizing all that corn. We would sell some corn. So we were using the same model that our cash crop farmers were using, and they were farming 500, 1,000, 2,000 acres. If those guys weren't cash flowing very well, what on earth makes us think that we can be profitable raising corn and selling it in that time period, conventionally? So, but we were doing that. We were selling corn because everybody else was. That's what the big guys were doing. Well, for us, we should have been running all our crops through animals. That's the most profitable way to raise crops and sell crops is walk it off the farm, either in milk or in meat. And we weren't doing that. I just lost my train of thought on your question again is the model still effective today? I just lost what I was going to say.
That's all right. I think we're in the same, again, similar type of situation today, except for 10x those 500 and 1,000 acre farms, 10x the acreage, and you have a lot of similar types of situations where you got 10,000 acres at razor thin margins, but doing it because they're running a lot of acreage. But small farms trying to replicate that will never ever work.
Yep. Now I just remember what I was going to say. We as small farms have to increase the value of whatever product we're producing in order to stay viable. So does that mean we need to have a grass-fed label or an organic label or a local label? It's different for every farm. For our farm, it's the organic label. It has increased the value of the product that we're producing. It has doubled the value of it, sometimes more and sometimes less, but generally it's increased it to where it's probably double the value versus conventional. So I think that's where we small farms, every time, this comes from Joel Salatin, and this is something that I heard at I heard a few things at that first grazing conference. The one thing, Joel Salatin was there at that day, a well-known speaker, who does a great job of speaking, by the way. But he said, so this was 2004. So this is before grazing was cool. This is before organic was cool. This is before local was cool. But he was doing the CSA model of farming. And he was telling us that it seems like every time the big get bigger, there's a door at the bottom that gets opened up for the small guy. So when we started when in America, we started running 1,000 acres per farm, and then we went up to 5,000 acres per farm, and now we're at 10,000 and more. Every time things got bigger and more integrated, I think they call that, there was an opportunity for someone at the bottom to do something very well on a local level and make a profit. And that sort of stuck with me, is that we'll never be able to compete with the big guys. Let's admit that right up front. But let's get better at what we're doing and add value to the product that we have. The other thing I heard that day that I wrote down, and I carried that, so they put a little postcard in every participant. At that conference, they gave everybody a little index card for jotting down notes. There was maybe a couple of index cards, but I wrote this down, this little quote from one of the speakers. I wrote it down, and I carried that. I filed that, and I had that in my desk for many years. And the speaker was talking about his farm and how it had evolved, very similar to my experience, although I had not experienced it at that time. He said one of the worst thing, let me rephrase that. The only thing worse than being small and inefficient is being big and inefficient. So, and at that time, I was still sort of thinking lots of cows, lots of milk, high production. I still had that in my mind. And when he said that, that told me, we need to get good at milking 20 cows before we think about milking 50 or 100 cows. And that resonated with me because it was very doable. So, and I think that still holds true today. Mm-hmm. Because if we're small and inefficient, we're sort of bleeding a little bit of cash or profitability. We're losing a little bit. But if we're big and inefficient, it's a gusher.
Mm-hmm. And I think the small farm, as the big get bigger, the opportunity to differentiate yourself from that model is just like you said, that there is a door open somewhere, whether it be now it's A2, mm-hmm. All these other little things, and there is a movement back toward kind of the small farm, I think.
Mm-hmm. The consumer wants to know where his food comes from. Mm-hmm. And, on that, this doesn't really pertain to my farm maybe, but I am excited about what agriculture has to offer to the consumer today on the small farm level. It's up to me, the farmer, to capitalize on those opportunities. It doesn't matter if it's produce or if it's poultry or if it's beef or if it's dairy. I think the market's out there and ready if we're able to capitalize on it.
Mm-hmm. So now we're up to transition to organic, and I'd like to know a little bit how those first years went with actually shipping organic milk, and how that learning curve was.
Okay, so in 2006, that was the first year of transition, and in 2009, we started shipping milk. So the transition years from 2006 to 2009. One of the first things that I had to learn, and so there was only maybe about 20 farmers in our particular area that were either in transition or certified already. So it was a pretty small group, and I remember one of the hardest things that I had to do was find new suppliers. I had to find a new fertilizer dealer, because the local fertilizer dealer, the one that wanted to sell me all the potash every fall, he had no idea what organic was. Matter of fact, they did not like that word because they saw it as a threat. And furthermore, it wasn't going to work anyway, according to them. So we also could no longer go up to the local hay auction and buy hay as needed. And that was harder to do than what we think, because that was where, at that time, that's where a lot of socializing went on. The veterinarian side of things was difficult, because if you had let's say you had a milk fever and you had to get a vet out to treat, and he walks on your farm and you tell him, now I'm organic and you can't use this or that, I can only use this or that. They felt threatened. And I can see why. We were doing things differently, and suddenly they had been trained to treat a cow a certain way, and suddenly we were telling them they couldn't do that anymore, so we were sort of stripping their tools away from them. So the veterinarian service was a tough one. However, we were fortunate. In about 2009 or 10, we had a local veterinarian company that had one vet. So it was a multi-man practice, and he had one vet that sort of embraced organics. And so he was always sent to the organic farms. So once we had that breakthrough, that went fairly well. Getting feed delivered to your farm, just for instance, calf feed, was difficult until we had a local mill embrace the organic movement. I never had to get creative, but some of the guys had to create their own calf feed if they wanted calf feed. On the farm, as far as the transition goes, we had, as far as raising corn and alfalfa, it wasn't as bad as we had thought, and we prepared ourselves for the worst. I remember that first year raising corn without a weed killer. I was scared, because I just knew, for one thing, I had Dad looking over my shoulder, and so the pressure was on. And the other thing was, we knew that we were being watched by the whole neighborhood, because every time one of the neighbors drove past in their buggy, their eyeballs were stuck in the window. You could see they were watching this farm. So we were under a lot of pressure. We were being watched closely. As far as the outcome of that first year, it wasn't that bad. And I think one of the things is we felt the pressure. We wanted to perform. We did not want to mess this thing up. Weed control was great in corn. We had a good crop. I'm trying to think. We did try to raise a small grain, and it was a field pea that we wanted to raise for protein. So protein, feeding organic protein to cows was expensive at that time. A lot of people did not feed protein. They just fed, either they tried to buy high quality hay or just fed more hay to increase the protein in their ration. Well, I decided I'm going to raise some field peas and use that as a supplemental protein. And that did not go very well as far as raising the field pea. The weeds took over, and it was a mess. And I was just thankful that this field was nowhere close to the front of the farm or the roadside. But we did get a harvest, and I think we harvested maybe 40 to 60 bushels per acre of field peas, and they fed well. They did the purpose. But as far as any major catastrophes, I really can't think of any.
That's good.
My biggest challenge was probably was my dad. And then as we were transitioning in 2006, going into 2009, by 2009, when I started transition, there was maybe 20, 25 farmers. And by the time I was fully transitioned and shipping milk, there was probably another 15, 20 farmers that were in transition. And what that created was a whole community of farmers, and we were all talking to each other. So by that time, we didn't have to all make the same mistakes, because we were talking to each other. And that is probably one of our biggest assets that we have in our organic community, is that we are willing to share. And that is priceless.
What did that look like back then? Getting together, and I guess I'm just going to quickly try and paint a picture. LaGrange County here, pretty heavily populated, densely populated, lots of small farms. But you're talking 45 farms in a matter of what, 20 square miles here. So horse and buggy is not always ideal to, gather a group of people, not just going to drive 10 minutes down the road. You got to make a commitment. What did that look like with a small group to get together and create a community?
So really, Organic Valley was instrumental in that. They actually facilitated a lot of those meetings. There was one type of meeting that we would have that was started, I believe it was started with just within the community. It was just a grassroots movement where we would designate an afternoon and we'd get together at a farm shop, maybe 20 of us guys, and somebody would pick topics for the afternoon, and we'd just have a farmers helping farmer. And I think after a year or two, Organic Valley got involved and helped facilitate all that. So really, my experience is a lot of the fellowship that happened was Organic Valley was instrumental in getting that together. Because I think that they saw the value in the farmer helping the farmer.
And the common denominator was everybody was shipping milk to Organic Valley, and that brought the people that were transitioning were in the same spot in their either transitioning or just organic. So the value coming from a person that's actually doing it versus a person that's telling you how to do it and is not doing it himself, that's invaluable. And that's, we see that in all the communities, how working together. I mean, I say it all the time. I don't pay my bills with a milk check, so you need to talk to somebody who's milking cows if you have that kind of question. But
one of the things that got us going on those afternoon farm shop meetings is our local SWCD, the local Soil and Water Conservation District. Before organics came into our community, they had this little thing that they called pasture walks. So getting back to how grazing got started in our community, this was probably middle 90s probably. A group of farmers started reading about managed and intensive grazing, and at some point they had a chance conversation with Dale Redding, and Dale Redding was the local conservationist with our Soil and Water. And one of the farmers wanted to rent a no-till drill that could interseed pasture seed in a pasture, which was sort of a new idea. Row crop farmers were no-tilling, but they were no-tilling in crop stubble. And this guy wanted to seed pasture into an existing pasture and wanted to know if the Soil and Water Conservation District had a no-till drill. They did not, but Dale had the intuition to ask questions as in, why? What are you doing? Why are you doing this? And what is the what's the purpose behind this? And so the farmer explained it to him, and Dale grabbed a hold of this idea and said, "Hey, we can help with this. What do you need?" And I don't know all the details, but that is how our local Soil and Water Conservation District got involved, and they got together. They figured out these farmers talked to Soil and Water, said, "Hey, we're getting together in an afternoon. We're going to walk a guy's pastures, look at his farm, look at his pastures, see what he's doing with fencing and manage intensive grazing." And they started facilitating that thing. So they helped concoct this idea of local farmers getting together in an afternoon and learning from each other. And then when organic came in about 2004, 2005, that idea had already been accepted. And organics follow grazing. So I know in Wisconsin, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, grazing wasn't what created organics. And in northern Indiana, grazing convinced us that we can farm organically. So it was and the two fit so well together. So our local Soil and Water probably were the first ones to really get this thing going, and then Organic Valley came in and just took it from there. So.
And so coming current, are we current right now, I think? So how has your operation changed since you've gone organic? Has it grown significantly? Well, I mean, you went from 15 cows to 45, But what other changes have happened and that you're doing now that you just changed and started doing because you figured something out?
So yeah, this is where I get really excited, because this is something that so when we were milking 25 cows or 20 cows, Dad told me when I took over the operation, he said, "You can't milk more than 20 cows on this farm. That's all this farm will support." And in his mind, buying feed was a sign of a poor manager, because if you had to buy inputs, you weren't managing your farm properly. So in his mind, 20 cows was tops. I haven't bought any acres since I took over the farm. Matter of fact, we've sold a few acres to some neighbors here or there, maybe 5 total acres. And we are milking 45 cows, and we're not buying feed. So that's what's exciting to me. Now, so that's how we started and where we're at today, and I'll talk about how we got there. So I learned through the years that our farm, and it doesn't matter, this applies to all farms, the land that we are in control of, that land is basically a solar panel. And whatever plants are in that acre, in that land, that plot of land, is the plants that are in there are harvesting sunlight, and that is converted to energy, and that is how we make our farms profitable. So the more plants we have out there, from as early in the growing season to as late as the growing season as possible, is what dictates how profitable our farms are. So I did not know that to begin with. That is a concept that I arrived at. So we have about 100 tillable acres. When I first started, we only had maybe 75, 80 tillable acres. There was some low ground that we just farmed around, and those acres were totally useless, except having cows stuck in them, where we had to get ropes and chains to pull those cows out of the swampy areas. But because of, and I don't know, was it pure luck or was I just seizing opportunity when I saw it, but I was able to tile some of those acres. And so we have added another 15 acres to our farm that we'll raise corn, we'll raise pasture, we'll raise hay on those acres because we've tiled them. We've made them farmable. So that has increased my acres without buying any acres. As far as our crop rotation goes, I learned early on from the grazing people that raising corn 4 years back to back it's a drain on your fertility, and it's not a way of raising good corn. So we sped up that crop rotation. In the past, when I started, we had a crop rotation of 3 to 4 years corn, and then 3 to 4 years of alfalfa, and then back to corn again. And sometimes we stuck in a seeding of oats. But generally it was corn and alfalfa. Today, we're raising corn back to back 2 years. So we'll raise first year corn, second year corn, and then it's back to a permanent pasture or an alfalfa grass seeding. And I've really fine-tuned this thing to where we don't like to see bare soil over the winter. I remember plowing an alfalfa field in the fall because I thought I didn't have time in the spring. So I plowed it in the fall and let it go. I let the soil expose to the elements the whole winter, and that was the only time I ever did that. I could see the detrimental effect of that because when it snowed and then when the wind blew, it is not normal to see brown snow beside a field. That's your topsoil that just left forever. And so that's something that I just, at the time that I saw it, I didn't really know what I was looking at, that was actually my profit leaving the farm. So, but just by reading and becoming knowledgeable with farms and then looking at my farm through different eyes, I figured this stuff out. So my crop rotation looks like this. We'll do corn, and then the first year corn is for grain, and then we try to come in, if the grain is harvested soon enough, we try to come in with a seeding of rye. We'll no-till rye right into the corn stubble if we can. If that isn't possible, if it's too late, first thing in the spring we'll go in and we'll take a disc through that corn stubble and loosen up the soil a little bit, and then we'll drill in 4-5 bushels per acre of oats. This is early spring, as soon as possible. And our soils are mostly sandy loam. It's not a heavy clay. We do have some muck soils, and those we do farm a little bit differently, but this is sandy loam. We're in there with 4 to 6 bushels of oats early in the spring. If you use bin run oats, you'll need 5 to 6 bushels. If you're going to use certified oats, you can get away with 3 to 4 bushels. And we'll sow those oats in there and let them grow. And once they reach about 16 inches, which is probably mid-May, early May, we'll plow those under. And here again, the idea is we're trying to harvest sunlight. And when you plow those under or disc them, you are turning energy that those oats collected from April 1st until May 15th. And you're plowing that under. That is energy for your next crop. I did not lose a crop. As far as it did not hurt my corn crop, I actually added to it. Then we'll raise another corn crop. We'll plow those oats under, plant it to corn again. That's second year corn. And we'll take that corn off as corn silage. And here again, we did a lot of tweaking through the years. We did not arrive at this crop rotation in 1 year's time. We are willing to give up a little bit of corn silage yield to lower the maturity date of our corn to get it off of that field faster, because we'll take the corn silage off, and right after the corn silage we'll come in with a seeding of alfalfa or pasture. But in our area, in order to make that fall seeding work, it has to be in the ground no later than September 20th. So we want to be harvesting corn silage by September 15th. So we'll take the corn crop off, and we're right in there with a seeding of oats or of pasture or alfalfa. That gets its start, and by next spring that thing is off and running and ready to go. We struggle with spring seeding of pasture or alfalfa. The whole year we're just so we'll put in a cover crop, we'll take off a good cutting of cover crop, and then it gets dry in June and July. Our new seedings struggle. We'll get a good dose of weeds, and basically all summer we're cutting weeds of some kind or another, unless we have rainfall is plentiful. Then we can do okay, but usually there's going to be a little bit of a dry spell somewhere. And then finally by September, you get a nice seeding of pasture or alfalfa. By that time, the year is over with. Mm-hmm. So we just wasted a whole year trying to get the seeding going. If we get that seeding in the fall, and then by next spring that thing is ready to go, and it's not going to yield what an established stand will, but you're not going to be fighting weeds. So again, we've tried to close that window where there's nothing growing. We take the corn silage off, and a week later we've got a permanent stand of grass growing or alfalfas. So then in our alfalfa fields, we'll probably go 4 years, and our pasture fields are probably close to 6 or 7 years. And then if I know so all my fields take their turn. I know if the alfalfa is 4 years old, I know that next year that thing's going to be corn. So the field that is in alfalfa gets earmarked in the spring. In my mind, I know that. So this is 2025. This spring of 2025, I know that next year this particular field will be corn. So that field gets earmarked in 2025. That is the first field that I cut for hay in the spring if I can. And I try to cut that field every 28 days. So generally speaking, that field is cut May 15th is first cutting. By June 13th, second cutting is done in that field. By July 11th, third cutting is done. And by August 9th or 10th, we've got 4 cuttings off of that field, and it's August 9th. And then we'll go in with a rotor tiller, and we'll till up that stand. We'll till it once. If there's a lot of grass in it, we'll have to till it twice because of all the root mass. But it doesn't have to be fancy. And we'll seed oats and turnips, and the oats and turnips needs to be in that field, needs to be in the ground by August 20th to the 25th. Then that will grow, and that will be my fall grazing, and we'll be grazing our permanent fields with the cows, and then we'll go into some hay fields, and then usually by about November 10th to the 15th, we'll go into this oats and turnips. And you have to remember that I already did get 4 cuttings of hay off, or of alfalfa off of this field. Now I'm going in with my cows, and we can graze from about November 15th until maybe Christmas time. There's times we went into January, but we don't plan on that. The seed book says that it is possible to get 4 tons of dry matter off of oats and turnips, and I question that, but no doubt you can get 2 to 3 tons of dry matter. That is after getting 4 cuttings of alfalfa. Usually, so in August, when you take that 4th cutting of alfalfa, if your farm is functioning the way it should be, you would think that there is no reason to plow that alfalfa field under, because it's doing well. And usually by late August, we start getting fall rains, and you would think that that's still a nice alfalfa field. I can get another cutting off of that. But that's sort of deceiving, because in the fall, alfalfa likes hot, dry weather. When we get into September, we get cool nights, and that alfalfa will not grow a whole lot. You are not losing a lot of tonnage. Plus, if you're coming in with oats and turnips, it's a place for the cow. If you're in a grazing situation anyway, oats and turnips is a place you can go with the cows when there's nothing else fit to be in. So oats and turnips does well for me.
Does that work well after frost?
Yes. Oats and turnips will keep their nutritional value until the air temperature gets down to, I believe it's 10 degrees. Okay. Then it will start using its value. The oats will lose it at 20 degrees, begin to lose at 20, and turnips will keep its feed value down to 10 degrees. Now, if they get snowed under, the turnips will be suffocated fairly quickly.
And then you go back into corn with that, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So that's the other beauty of this. There is something about oats and turnips before going to a corn. It raises corn like nothing else. So in an organic setting, we like to plant corn into an old alfalfa field because of the nitrogen that the alfalfa field provides for the corn crop. By sticking in a oats and turnips before the corn, we're not taking anything away from the corn. We're actually adding to it. I don't know what turnips does, but it does something to the soil that it increases corn yield. We're pushing 200 bushel corn. Wow. And the other thing that we're doing is, usually we would plow our alfalfa fields in the spring and then plant it to corn. Now we're plowing or tilling in August prior to the corn year. We're getting another 2 tons of dry matters and grazing oats and turnips. And then in the spring, we're still coming in and planting corn on time. Now we are playing with this idea of planting cereal rye with the oats and turnips so that there is a little bit of a cover crop to plow down in the spring. The jury is still out on how well that works. I know one thing, we can't graze the oats and turnips tight because we're going to ruin the cereal rye. So in the past, we have come in after we've grazed. So when you graze oats and turnips, that field will look bare when you're done. In the spring, it'll be bare. So we did come in, for a few years, we did come in with some oats, about 3 bushels of oats, and planted that in on that bare field, let that grow at about 14 to 16 inches, and then we plow that under. I will tell you that doing that, planting oats at 4 to 6 bushels, it gets expensive. But I still think it's worth it. But if we can save a trip across the field, if we can save a trip across the field by planting rye with the oats and turnips in the fall, and if it works, we'll definitely go that route.
Definitely be worth a shot, and it's not going to cost that much
No.
to throw some rye seed or some triticale in there.
We're also not, when we're tilling that alfalfa field, we are intentionally not killing all the alfalfa. That's another thing we've changed. In the past, we really worked that ground in the fall before we planted oats and turnips. You don't have to do that because you're for two reasons. In the fall, your alfalfa plants give up pretty easily. It doesn't want to grow very fast in September, as I said before. And so you don't need, if you get a 75% kill of your alfalfa stand, you're good to go. That alfalfa may come back a little bit, and I actually want it to come back because it acts as a plow down in the spring. So if the alfalfa does come back a little bit, it'll grow a little bit, and then the oats and turnips take over, and it outcompetes that. But you do need some bare soil to get the oats and turnips in there. So we're also working on trying to find that balance of killing some of the alfalfa to get the seeding of oats and turnips started, but not killing all the alfalfa so that there is something there growing in the spring. And that's exciting because it's the potential of farms, the potential profit of our farm is unlimited. I don't think that I will ever get my farm to the point where it's maxed out in productivity. I don't think I will. I think there's always something new and to get better. A lot of the stuff I arrived at, a lot of the stuff as far as the crop rotation is concerned, I arrived at by tweaking the system. So for years we were satisfied. I remember back in the day we were satisfied by, we'd take corn silage off and that field was bare until the next spring we plowed it and put in another corn crop or alfalfa. And that was just the way it was. And today, I could not sleep if that field was bare from September 15th until April 15th or May 15th the following year. We're losing a lot of sunlight. So our idea is always got to have something growing all the time.
See, your 2 years of corn in a row is completely opposite than what I'm used to hearing about, consecutive years of corn, because usually it's the first year is corn silage, go in with a triticale or a cover crop right after the corn silage, plow that down for your second year corn, but then follow it the following spring with a spring seeding. But it is exactly what you said. You are mowing weeds all summer long. So if you can flip that, for us, we would have to go with a shorter season grain corn in order to get any rye or anything established in the fall.
In the fall.
So, but that's the first time I've ever heard that. And that
Really?
is super interesting.
So I was doing it the opposite. I was doing it just as you explained. We would always do corn silage first to get that cover crop in there, and then grain the second year, and then we'd always have to deal with the weeds from the new seeding the following year. And I got to this, and this doesn't work on every farm. There's areas where they can't do fall seedings. They have to do spring, and so then this wouldn't work. But I think sometimes if we tweak some things, and here another thing that we had to learn, we had to give up. We were used to growing 110, 112 day corn to maximize yield for corn silage. Well, if we did that, we were getting, because of our planting dates in late May of being organic, we wanted that soil warm. We want that thing 70 degrees and rising before we plant our corn. Sometimes that's May 25th. If we're going to plant 110, 112 day corn, we're going to be in late September by the time we get that off as corn silage, and it's too late. So we have backed our maturity date down to about 100, between 100 and 105. I've found that if your maturity date, your corn goes below 100 days, the corn just doesn't do very well. It's something about that 100-day point. If you can go 102, there's some pretty good corn out there that you can raise for corn silage. Our corn silage yields between 26 and 28 tons consistently. It's phenomenal, and it's second-year corn. If we go to 110, 112, we can probably gain a few tons, maybe. But I am willing to back off my yield on corn silage. 26 tons is nothing to cry about. I'm willing to release a few tons of corn silage in order to get my alfalfa seeding in the fall, because that is what this farm functions on. is a good stand of alfalfa. And if that stand of alfalfa is in there, is rooted down in the fall, is ready to go in the spring, it's hard to beat that. So and that's all. That thing just excites me. That's what's so exciting about organic farming. About farming, I could talk all day about all those things, and it's just that's why I say that we won't ever maximize the potential of this farm. I won't. We're doing okay, but there's always something new to learn, and we tweak a little bit here and we tweak a little bit there. Right now, I'm thinking, what's going to be next? You know, how can we change this thing? Even our cow numbers. If we move away from the crop rotation, we talk about cows. I've found that every farm has a sweet spot as far as cow numbers are concerned. And it has to do with available labor. It has to do with available land. It has to do with what your housing looks like during the winter. Right now, our sweet spot is about 45 cows. There was a time when it was 35 cows. And then we made some changes and we were able to up that number to 45. The change that we made there is we went to a custom heifer grower. So at one point in time, all the animals were raised on our farm and our buildings were maxed out. And I discovered that I know myself well enough that I discovered that my growing heifers are the first group of cattle that gets ignored if I get busy. And I've decided that if we fail our growing heifers, it's going to cost us milk production. So right at that time, I was probably one of the first guys that embraced this idea of going to a custom heifer grower. And I remember, so we talked about numbers, you know, how much do we have to pay this guy per head per day to make it worth his time? And how much can I afford to pay? And the number looked astronomical to me. It was close to $2.50 per head per day from the time it was a weaned calf until it was a springer. And I don't remember the number, but it was I was spending close to $2,000 per head to have him raise that calf for me. This was probably 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And I thought it was a big number. It was basically making another mortgage payment every month to have him feed all my cows or calves and heifers. But we did do that. And what happened was we emptied the heifer barn. So the heifers left the property. And then that allowed me to milk 5 to 6 cows more because I had more room. So those 5 extra cows actually paid the heifer grower. And then the other thing that happened, this happened slowly. The other thing happened is that those heifers received his dairy quality hay. Mm-hmm. On my farm, they were getting heifer hay, which was costing me milk. But they were basically the trash barrel. If there was a type of hay that the cows didn't eat or didn't milk well on, the heifers got it. Now those heifers are getting his dairy quality hay, and my cows are getting my dairy quality hay. And then it comes back to the drought risk. If those heifers are on his farm, even if there is a drought, there is still some good quality hay available, and my heifers are still getting that good quality hay. They're coming home, and their frame is done. So in the past, you could always pick out my heifers. They freshened, got into the herd, and you can still pick out those fresh heifers in the herd just because they were smaller. They were still growing. Mm-hmm. So they were trying to make milk, trying to get bred back, trying to raise another calf within the cow, and still growing that frame. That was a huge tax on that particular animal. Today, they're coming home, they get fed well, and so once they hit the milking string, they're done growing, more so, and they can focus on milk production. And in my mind, that custom heifer grower, I don't pay him, he pays himself in increased milk production on my farm. So getting back to the sweet spot, I think that as your available labor changes, as even feed prices change, the sweet spot on your farm moves. And I think it's up to the farmer to maximize or figure out where that sweet spot is. Just for instance, right now, we're buying supplemental protein, roasted beans and bean meal. We're buying more bean meal now than we ever have. We are feeding close to 3 pounds of bean meal and it's paying. In the past, we would always feed maybe a quarter to three quarters to a pound of bean meal because we thought it was just something that fit the ration well. Today, we're feeding probably double that, if not triple that, because there's a need for milk in the market, and the market is paying us to feed protein.
And the price of protein's down too.
The price of protein is down. I don't know exactly where it's at, but I think it's what we pay for a ton of protein. We're getting paid back 3 times that, close to that. It's amazing.
It's kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah. And it's fun. Mike, milk production on our farm is in the month of December compared to last year, December, we're up 25%. In January, it looks to be the same. It's amazing.
So this scratches that high production itch that you used to have back in the day a little bit?
It makes me nervous, actually.
Because I have seen that guys who go organic and stop the high production model, a lot of those guys still like full udders. And when you have a good year and things are clicking and that production is up, makes you check the dipstick a couple of times.
One other thing we've changed is we started feeding haylage. So we're chopping, and so in the past we did dry hay, then we moved into balage, and now we're doing a little bit of haylage. And I kind of like that idea of that chopped up hay. I don't think that I would never think of feeding my cows all haylage, because I think it's too much finely chopped hay. They need some long stemmed hay. But feeding a part of the ration as chopped hay, I think there's a benefit to it. I can't put my finger to it exactly, but I think there's something in chopped hay that increases feed efficiencies. It seems that ever since we've been chopping hay, and so during the winter ration consists of 30 pounds corn silage. This is as fed, 30 pounds as fed corn silage, and about 30 pounds of haylage as fed. Both of those are in that 65-70% moisture range. And then the rest is maybe 4 pounds of dry hay, some grain, and then some balage. Ever since we're feeding chopped hay, we have tons and tons of feed left over in the spring. I'm still trying to figure this thing out, but there's something to be said with, does a cow not use as much energy to regurgitate that feed and finish it off before it hits the second stomach?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Don't know that it's really driving milk production, but I think my feed efficiency has increased.
Mm-hmm.
We should be
efficiency is milk production.
Well, yeah, you're right. It is. You're right. Mm-hmm. According to my feed inventory, we should be milking 60 cows.
So is that your next move?
It is. Mm-hmm. We're going to have to make some. I mean, we don't have enough free stalls. We don't have enough feeding area. We're going to have to make some changes there. But so this is sort of ironic, but so my youngest son helps me on the farm, and he's thinking he wants to broaden his horizons. So he's my youngest son, and I've still got 4 girls that are willing to help. So I'm thinking that I need to increase cow numbers because I've got milkmaids coming along, and we're going to have to milk more cows so they don't have as much field work because they're going to be grazing their feed, right? So I don't know if this is going to go over well with these milkmaids or not, but I'm thinking we're going to have to figure out how to milk 60 cows in our system.
And then actually buy feed in?
I'm not sure we're going to have to buy a lot of feed, but yeah, maybe.
But the goal would be to go from 20 cows to 60 cows and still be feed self-sufficient?
That would be the goal. Yeah. I'm thinking I'm going to have to buy a little bit of feed. So essentially we are buying feed because our heifers are off the farm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think that this is really backwards. I've got all this feed and I'm paying somebody else to feed my heifers, but I always come back to this labor thing. I know myself well enough to know that if I get busy, those growing heifers are going to get neglected. Mm-hmm. It's going to be detrimental. So I have also found, talking about sweet spots, our farms are the most profitable if we're buying a little bit of feed. Now, I say that in a nutshell. If our management is careless, that makes us buy feed. That's not going to make our farm profitable. But if our farm is running at maximum speed, we should be buying a little bit of feed. I think that our profits are higher. We found that in our financial papers that the farms that spend a fair amount of money on fertility and buying in feed are the most profitable farms.
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing is, if you're buying in feed, you can buy the quality that you want. And one of the things that I've found as well is that, so in organics, we buy feed based off of a forage sample. And so the price of feed is based off of what the RFQ is, what the quality is. So we always we think that we don't want to buy too good of a quality hay because it's going to cost more. But I've found, and so let's say the highest quality feed on the farm is 160. So, well, if we buy 160 RFQ hay, we're matching ours and it should be good. I find that if I'm going to buy hay, I'm going to buy 200 RFQ plus hay because the freight is going to be the same. It's going to be the same cost. And if you can elevate your top quality hay instead of bringing in a lower quality hay and diminish your quality hay, you're going to lose milk. If you can elevate your quality, it's always going to pay. So the one thing I like about buying feed is you can increase the value of your feed by blending a higher quality feed. I found that if we buy a forage that has a high calcium content and the protein and the sulfur content is within a ratio, just about can't screw up that feed. It's going to feed well.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway.
Yep. Well, Marlin, we could go on for another couple of hours, but we do have to wrap it up. Thank you so much for your time. It was really interesting to hear the history, and what you've got going on here is really, really cool and really impressive. So thank you for taking the time to sit down with us.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlin.